Good afternoon. So today I'll be talking about some of the developments in the World War II Ustasha state and how they pertain to some of the larger topics we hope to discuss here. Historians of World War II Yugoslavia have commonly portrayed the Croatian Ustasha movement that established the independent state of Croatia during World War II as an illegitimate group of violent fanatics who received virtually no support from the population they ruled over. The notion that most of Croatia's population almost immediately rejected the violent racial national ideology of the Ustashas contains numerous problematic assumptions. By assuming that Ustasha brutality immediately compelled much of the population to resist the regime, scholars have often neglected the confusion that prevailed as Croatian officials and soldiers sought to pursue the Ustasha regime's poorly defined policies against Serbs, Roma, and Jews. In many cases, the confusion over who did and did not belong to the Croatian national community allowed those marked for exclusion to maneuver within the often ambiguous definitions of race and nation and thus try and avoid persecution. This confusion also led many of those the Ustashas wanted to persecute to re-articulate their identities in an effort to comply with the new authorities and make themselves acceptable citizens of the new state. A second problem with an exaggerated focus on Ustasha brutality has led several scholars to partially romanticize the communist partisan resistance, the guerrilla movement, against the Ustashas as one that was animated by the rebels' commitment to anti-fascism and multi-ethnic tolerance among the different ethnic groups living in Yugoslavia. A closer look at some Serb-dominated partisan rebel units within World War II Croatia demonstrates that many Serb guerrillas who initially took up arms to save their lives from Ustasha massacres later began advocating extensive collaboration with the Germans, Italians, and even in some cases Ustasha forces. The rigid discipline the partisan communist leadership enforced thus may have played more of a decisive role in preventing Serb guerrillas from collaborating with the Axis than their alleged commitment to anti-fascism and ethnic tolerance. To better comprehend the interaction between the Ustashas and some of the subjects they sought to persecute, one must clarify some developments within Croatian nationalism in the decades leading up to the Ustasha's seizure of power in 1941. Though pre-World War II nationalist movements in Croatia often engaged in a very inflammatory rhetoric, their main focus was on integrating as many people into the nationalist movements rather than excluding people from it as they looked for followers. So even famous nationalist ideologues like Vuk Karadžić and Ante Starčević sought to include as many followers into their national programs as they could. The inflammatory and kind of violent rhetoric was usually geared against those who failed to acknowledge their belonging to a certain national community. So Vuk Karadžić would, curse at Serbs who failed to recognize their Serbs and thought they were something else. Such development ensures that nationalist movements included people from different ethno-religious backgrounds. This made the fact that Josip Frank, a Croatian Jew who abandoned Judaism and converted to Catholicism as an adult, inherited the leadership of Ante Starčević's far-right party, the Croatian Party of the Rights. The fact that Frank, as a Jewish convert, rose to the most radically nationalist faction of the party, the Frankovci, in the late 19th and early 20th century, was also not surprising. As such, Frank served as kind of a ideologue for the Ustasha movement and their poglavnik Ante Pavelić. Pavelić actually retained the name Frankists up until the mid-30s when he started calling the movement the Ustasha movement rather than the Frankist movement. The 1930s is also when Ustasha ideology became more anti-Semitic. Yet the fact that in the mid-30s the Ustashas were not yet formally allied with the Nazis resulted in a situation where they had some followers who were Jewish and even some people who were higher-ranking members who had Jewish wives or even people of Jewish backgrounds in their family trees. Once Hitler invaded Yugoslavia, the Ustashas and the Nazis were allies despite a lack of much previous collaboration. And immediately upon the Croatian Declaration of Independence, the Ustasha passed a regulation protecting Aryan blood and honor of the Croatian nation. The NDH's recent alliance with Nazi Germany thus forced the Ustashas to appropriate very clear guidelines that Nazi ideology employed when determining who was and who was not racially a Jew. As a result, the Ustashas had very little flexibility in protecting Jews loyal to their movement, who were now subject to Nazi racial legislation. Unlike the very straightforward guidelines for Jews, Ustasha regulations for what made a person a Serb remained vague and caused further confusion. A similar problem would emerge as the Ustashas attempted to distinguish between in the Ustasha discrimination campaign against the Romani, as it was difficult to determine who was Romani and who was a member of a Croatian Aryan. The fact that many Jews and Jewish converts had seen themselves as Croats prior to World War II likely made the Ustashas and the Croatian nationalists less antagonistic towards the Jews than the Serbs, who they believed supported a Serbian nationalist agenda directly in conflict with Croatian calls for independence. Nevertheless, Nazi guidelines defining Jews made it difficult for Ustashas to save those they deemed good Croats. This, however, did not preclude Jewish inhabitants of Croatia from petitioning to Ustasha authorities and explaining why they should be considered Aryan Croats and good citizens of the independent state of Croatia. While some of these letters constituted clear efforts by the petitioners to opportunistically evade persecution and save their lives, others demonstrate that a rather genuine commitment to the Croatian national cause and a sense of severe disillusionment with their exclusion from the Ustasha's nation-building project. Petitioners would commonly ask the authorities to have their Jewish-sounding names changed into something that sounded more Croatian. Others argued that their purely Aryan husband or wife should be reason enough to consider them pure Croats. And many would stress that they had been persecuted during the interwar Yugoslav state for their Croatian nationalism in the Serb-dominated Yugoslav state. Some even submitted court documents showing that they were arrested and hassled by the authorities because of their Croatian nationalism. I have no time to discuss many of these cases, but I can refer to the case of Rudolf Spiegler, a sculptor and painter from Zagreb, who authored a very angry letter to Mile Budak, a high-ranking Ustasha official, in 1941. After noting that he, like Jesus of Nazareth, abandoned Judaism for Christianity, Spiegler outlined his loyalty to the Croatian nation and his unparalleled hatred of the Serbs. His hatred for the Serbs has led tension with several of his family members who, he argued, had supported a Serb-dominated Yugoslav state. They could not tolerate him because, as he stated, quote, "I had always hated Serbs, Serbdom, and Yugoslavia." As a Jew, Spiegler claims he could have lived well in Yugoslavia. Serb elites, he believed, granted the Jews a privileged position as both Serbs and Jews persecuted the Croats together. Spiegler went on to note that he had no Jewish qualities and stated that he always worked honestly and never engaged in shady business practices, which some Ustashas associated with Jewish behavior. Several leading Croatian nationalists, Spiegler noted, would testify to his patriotism, and he even was claimed to have been a friend of Pavelić during his years at a university. As a devoted Croatian nationalist, Yugoslav authorities has persecuted Spiegler since most of his artwork contained illegal Croatian nationalist themes during the interwar period. The Ustasha movement, he noted, even used some of his artwork in their pamphlets. Concluding the letter, he noted, quote, "The Croatian nation has been strung up to a cross for more than 800 years, and along with it, the person who has penned this letter, who asks for nothing more to continue living an honest life with his Aryan wife and her 80-year-old mother. Regardless, I am treated as if I were a Jew, so I am submitting this request, asking that I be treated as a man." While it may be impossible for us to determine whether Spiegler's letter constituted a genuine attempt, a genuine disillusionment, or a clever attempt to maneuver within the Ustasha's frequently inconsistent and ambiguous definitions of nation and race, it is important that we can see to an extent that he, to an extent, appropriated some of the discriminatory discourse the Ustashas employed while attempting to define himself as somebody who fully belonged within the Croatian national community. While many petitions appropriated these exclusive categories of Ustasha ideology as petitioners sought to avoid persecution, others voiced a more visibly genuine disappointment with their inability to, as Jews, participate in the Croatian national project. Jakob Ozmo, who described himself in a petition as a Jew Croat from Zenica, addressed his letter directly to Ante Pavelić. Explaining that he had been a lifelong member of several Croatian nationalist organizations, Ozmo continued by noting that he felt saddened by the exclusion of Jews from public life in Croatia. Quote, "I cannot understand why the independent state of Croatia could not be a mother to us Jews as well," end quote. After apologizing for wasting the Pavelich's valuable time, Osmo concluded, quote, I will, despite my humiliation and my lack of rights, as a Jew Croat, breathe for the good of the Croats, that elite of mankind who I had the privilege of being friends with and working with for my entire life. And even if I am no longer allowed to wear the symbol of the Croatian Workers' Association, I will conceal it with a red, white, and blue handkerchief and wear it by my heart until my last breath. Let me now salute you with our famous greeting, Zadom spremni, for the homeland ready. In a different case, Shandor Braun, a Jewish industrialist from the town of Đurđevac, went to great lengths to restore a right that he believed the Ustasha state had unjustly deprived him of. In the process, he jeopardized his life and safety to a much greater extent than had he obeyed some of the laws he was protesting. In June of 1941, Braun decided to celebrate Ante Starčević's birthday in the same way he did every previous year, by flying a Croatian flag from his home. This upset the officials from the local Ustasha headquarters. They apprehended Braun, confiscated the flag, and informed him about new regulations prohibiting Jews from flying state flags. The subsequent day, Braun appeared before the local Ustasha headquarters demanding that they return his flag and that they allow him to fly it. When the local officials refused, he decided to directly address the Ministry of Internal Affairs in Zagreb. In his letter to the ministry, he noted that he had previously successfully petitioned to become exempt from wearing the Jewish star and demanded that he be allowed to fly the Croatian flag on public holidays. Noting that he had worked with Croat nationalists for his whole life, he concluded, I consider myself Croatian by nationality, even if by faith I am a Jew. Despite his efforts to demonstrate his unrestrained loyalty to the Croatian cause, the authorities denied him the right to celebrate public holidays. Unlike petitioners who had, to some extent, like Spiegler, possibly approved some Ustasha measures against minorities, Osmo and Braun voiced their disappointment with the relegation of Jews to a marginal status and implored the regime to accept Jews as equal citizens. As a result, they were different from petitions like Spiegler's, who wanted to be classified as Aryan, but to some degree accepted the necessity of persecuting those who still exhibited non-Aryan, Serbian, and Jewish traits. The Ustasha campaign against the Romani encountered comparable problems as the Ustasha sought to enforce their racial legislation. Croatia presented an atypical case in the enforcement of anti-Roma kind of pro-Nazi legislation, as a sizable segment of the Romani in the NDH were of the Muslim faith. While the Ustashas deemed the Romani as racial inferiors, Ustasha ideology accepted Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina as Aryan Croats. And this made distinguishing between a Romani and a Muslim Croat very difficult. Additionally, the willingness of imams to forge documents and convert Romanis to Islam, as Mark Biondić's work has shown, further complicated this process. Nevertheless, several individuals and groups of people labeled as Romani by the Ustasha state sought to exploit this inconsistency in Ustasha racial policy while simultaneously attempting to comply with the new state's ideology. An example from a community in Pitomača reveals the problems of anti-Ustasha Roma legislation and the manner in which a group of people categorized as Romanis sought to redefine themselves as Aryan Croats. In November of 1941, Ivan Ivanović wrote the Ministry of Internal Affairs with a grievance. About 70 families from his community, he wrote, had faced persecution at the hands of local Ustasha officials who had harassed them under the excuse that they were gypsies. Ivanović noted that his whole community had always considered themselves Croats. He then listed a number of traits stereotypically deemed as characteristic of the Romani, and said that no members of his community exhibited these traits, ever. Members of his community, he stated, lived in brick homes, never lived nomadic lifestyles typical of the Romani. Most of his community owned property, and some even had farmland, which they worked. In this way, he stated they were different from the Romani, who, he believed, stole and never wanted to work for a living. His neighbors all had Nordic traits: light hair, light skin, blue eyes. None of them had dark Romani features. While Ivanović noted that some women from the community may have strayed and engaged in sexual relations with nomadic Romani men in the past, he reminded authorities that such things happened in all parts of the country, and that every village where a woman engaged in sexual acts with a Romani man should, in that case, be considered a Romani village. Repeating again that the whole community consider themselves loyal Aryan Croats, Ivanović suggested that the Ministry of Internal Affairs dispatch what he's called a committee of medical experts to examine the community's racial origins as urgently as possible, since the abuse from local authorities had become unbearable. He ended even by noting that he would volunteer his own body to be inspected by the experts, who would, he believed, unanimously agree that he and the rest of the community were Aryan Croats. On one hand, Ivanović's petitions revealed the inconsistencies evident in Ustasha racial ideology. By suggesting the deployment of medical examiners to Pitomacha, he may have even been mocking Ustasha racial regulations because he presumably knew that medical experts really had no way of demonstrating that members of his community were physiologically or biologically distinguishable from neighbors who had been classified as Aryans. Nevertheless, in seeking to maneuver through an inconsistent racial and ideology to define himself as an Aryan Croat, Ivanović endorsed some of the discriminatory categories the state employed against the Romani. By noting that members of his community lived in brick houses, did not intermarry, avoided nomadic lifestyles, and owned intended property and livestock, Ivanović endorsed the language of a state that had attempted to apply these categories to marginalize him and his community. While the Ustasha regime faced countless problems in persecuting the Roma community, which they often struggled to clearly define, and the Jewish community, which included many individuals who had considered themselves bona fide Croatian nationalists, they encountered the most problems in their campaign against Croatia's Serbian Orthodox community. This was particularly so because of the large size of the community, which, at the time of the Ustasha seizure of power, constituted just under a third of the country's population. Additionally, problems arose because it was difficult to define who was and who was not a Serb, or who was to be or not to be treated as a Serb, according to Ustasha guidelines. As soon as the Ustasha movement took power in 1941, the Ministry of Internal Affairs was overwhelmed with letters from local commanders asking the Ministry of Internal Affairs to define what made somebody a Serb, and the answers they received were very inconsistent. One of them, for example, said, in many cases, Serbs had volunteered for the new state's forces, and this compelled local commanders to ask the ministry who they cannot accept. And in some cases, people said to refer to religion, but then other commanders would say that Serbian Orthodoxy was not enough alone to prove that somebody was racially a Serb, and this caused a lot of confusion. Despite this confusion, massacres against the Serbian Orthodox different Serbian Orthodox communities throughout Croatia and Bosnia continued, and ultimately led to a large-scale rebellion. This rebellion was initially Serb-led, but was later joined by both Croats and Muslims opposed to the Ustasha regime and their allies. The large size of the Serbian Orthodox minority and the frequency of Ustasha massacres against them has led us to some extent, historians to some extent, to romanticize the resistance that emerged against them. Idealizing the partisan communist fighters that fought against them as kind of uncompromising fighters against fascism and domestic traitors. Yet my research into the Kordun region, a predominantly Serb-inhabited partisan stronghold during World War II, suggests that many lower-ranking partisan leaders and partisan soldiers from the area opposed the Central Communist Party's leadership's campaign of uncompromising resistance and wanted to reach an agreement with the Axis. Several local partisan leaders believed too many lives were being lost by fighting and encouraged their soldiers to lay down their arms, reach an agreement with the Germans and Italians and even the Ustashas, which they believed could save lives. This actually forced the Central Committee of Croatia to conduct extensive purges in the Kordun region, where they ultimately had to kill several hundred soldiers loyal to a local leader named Misha Napielo, who advocated that operations against the Nazis be suspended and that Serbian lives be spared in that way. So just to conclude, since I'm pretty much out of time, given that the conference is based upon collaboration, a category that can often be very unclear and vague, and one that I'm not sure applies to some of the instances I demonstrated here. But I hope the paper has to some extent shown instances in which people who are persecuted, and very clearly persecuted by a certain state, seek to employ some of its categories to define themselves as people who belong, while relegating others as not good enough Croats or Aryans, or what you have it. And whether we have some terminology or some analytical categories to define such behavior in World War II Europe.
Und vielen Dank auch für die Einladung zu dieser Konferenz. Ich werde den Blick jetzt auf Ungarn lenken und hier vor allem am Beispiel der Ghettoisierung diskutieren, wie viel Gestaltungsraum bei der Umsetzung antijüdischer Maßnahmen es in Ungarn gegeben hat. Ich werde mich dabei vor allem auf ein Dokument konzentrieren, das auch vor kurzem teilweise abgedruckt wurde, in dem vom USHMM herausgegebenen Band The Holocaust in Hungary, Evolution of a Genocide, was auch in diesem Prospekt angekündigt wird. Und zwar ist es ein Dokument der Stadtverwaltung Debrecen aus Mai 1944. Am 8. Mai 1944, 2 Monate nach der deutschen Besatzung des Landes, trafen sich im kleinen Besprechungszimmer des Rathauses in Debrecen wichtige Vertreter der örtlichen Stadtverwaltung. Die Tagesordnung der Besprechung enthielt lediglich einen Punkt: Fragen zur Einrichtung des Ghettos in der Stadt mussten entschieden werden. Das von der Sitzung zufällig erhaltene Protokoll, das übrigens erst Jahrzehnte später von einem Neuzeithistoriker unter Dokumenten aus dem frühen 19. Jahrhundert entdeckt wurde, dokumentiert in eindrücklicher Weise den Handlungsspielraum der ungarischen Behörden bei der Vorbereitung der Ghettoisierung und Deportation der ungarischen Juden. Diese lokale behördliche Ebene der Kollaboration steht eben im Fokus meiner folgenden Ausführungen, und ich interessiere mich dabei vor allem für die Fragen, welchen Einfluss die örtliche Verwaltung auf die Lebensbedingungen in den Ghettos hatte, inwieweit konnte sie radikalisierend oder auch entradikalisierend auf staatlich gefällte Entscheidungen einwirken und wie stark arbeitete sie mit deutschen Behörden zusammen beziehungsweise konnte eigenständig agieren. Die Ghettoisierung der jüdischen Bevölkerung in Ungarn begann im europäischen Vergleich relativ spät. Bis zur deutschen Besatzung des Landes am 19. März 1944 hatte das autoritär-konservative Horthy-Regime die einheimischen Juden vor Deportation und physischer Vernichtung weitgehend bewahrt, auch wenn es zuvor schon Deportationen und Massakern gegeben hat. Aber nach dem deutschen Einmarsch kollaborierte die neu eingesetzte Regierung unter Ministerpräsident Dömer-Stoyaj umso wirkungsvoller. Am 22. April 1944 stellte Edmund Wesenmayer, Hitlers Bevollmächtigter in Ungarn, mit Zufriedenheit fest, dass die antijüdische Gesetzgebung, ich zitiere aus seinem Bericht, mit einer für die hiesigen Verhältnisse ungewöhnlichen Schnelligkeit verabschiedet werde. Dabei bemühte sich Wesenmayer, Ungarn ein hohes Maß an Eigenständigkeit und Handlungsfreiheit zu gewähren, um auf diese Weise die Besatzungsmacht von den unmittelbaren Verwaltungs- und Polizeiaufgaben zu entlasten. Dadurch sollte die Zahl der benötigten deutschen Soldaten im Land gering gehalten werden. So wurde auch der Großteil der antijüdischen Verordnungen von ungarischer Seite ausgearbeitet und umgesetzt. Ab April 1944 unterlagen alle Juden ab dem Alter von 6 Jahren der Kennzeichnungspflicht durch einen gelben Stern an der Kleidung. Gleichzeitig wurde auch ein Berufsverbot erlassen, und kurz nach der Besatzung begannen die ungarischen Behörden mit der Beschlagnahmung von Radios, Telefonapparaten, Autos und schließlich des gesamten jüdischen Vermögens. Aber nicht nur die ungarische Regierung bemühte sich mit Hilfe diverser Maßnahmen, die Ausschaltung der ungarischen Juden aus dem gesellschaftlichen und wirtschaftlichen Leben voranzutreiben, sondern auch zahlreiche Privatpersonen wendeten sich mit Vorschlägen an den neuen Innenminister. So zum Beispiel eine anonyme Person, der regte an, dass jüdische Häuser enteignet werden und sie ihren nichtjüdischen Untermietern zugesprochen werden. Und dabei war nicht ganz eigennützig, er war nämlich selber ein nichtjüdischer Untermieter eines jüdischen Hauses. Diese Person forderte zudem die Einführung von Ausweisen für Urungarn, wie er sie nannte, und bat um eine Verordnung, die verbietet, dass nichtjüdische Kinder mit jüdischen Kindern spielen. Eine andere Person arbeitete ein Vorschlagspapier über die Trennung von neugeborenen Kindern von ihren jüdischen Eltern aus und sprach sich dafür aus, dass diese Kinder nichtjüdischen Familien zugesprochen werden zur Adoption, wo sie im christlichen Glauben erzogen werden. In zahlreichen weiteren Schreiben wurde der Wunsch geäußert, die örtliche jüdische Bevölkerung in Ghettos unterzubringen. Tatsächlich erließ auch am 7. April 1944 der ungarische Innenminister die streng geheime Anordnung, die Juden abzusondern und in regionalen Sammelagern zu internieren. 9 Tage später wurde das erste Ghetto auf dem damaligen ungarischen Gebiet, nämlich in der annektierten Karpato-Ukraine, errichtet. Bis Anfang Juni 1944 wurden über 400.000 Juden in mehr als 170 Ghettos zusammengefasst, sodass die Ghettoisierung in Ungarn mit Ausnahme von Budapest in wenigen Wochen fast vollständig abgeschlossen war. Die Budapester Juden mussten ab Mitte Juni 1944 in der Nähe von Fabriken, Bahnhöfen und anderen potenziellen Zielen alliierter Luftangriffe in sogenannte gelbe Häuser ziehen. Die meisten Ghettos in Ungarn bestanden nur kurze Zeit. Die Ghettobewohner wurden bereits nach wenigen Wochen in das Konzentrations- und Vernichtungslager Auschwitz-Birkenau oder in Ausnahmefällen in das österreichische Lager Straßhof-Nordbahn deportiert. Die Reihenfolge der Konzentration und Deportation richtete sich nach den Gendarmeriedistrikten, wobei als erstes die jüdische Bevölkerung der im Zuge der Wiener Schiedsprüche und durch Kriegshandlungen annektierten Gebiete zur Deportation vorgesehen war. Ihnen folgten die Distrikte im Kernland. Obwohl mit der Koordination und Überwachung der Ghettoisierung bzw. der Deportation Eichmars Sondereinsatzkommando betraut wurde, war dieses bei ihrer Arbeit maßgeblich auf die ungarische Regierung, die Verwaltung, ein Teil der politischen Führungsschicht und der Bevölkerung angewiesen. Schließlich bestand das Sondereinsatzkommando aus lediglich 150 bis 200 Personen. Dabei hatte vor allem die lokalen Behörden viel Handlungsspielraum, vor allem der eindeutige, auf die praktische Umsetzung bezogene zentrale Regierungsverordnungen fehlten, so zum Beispiel auch, was die Einrichtung der örtlichen Ghettos betraf. So bestimmten die Entscheidungen der lokalen Verwaltung maßgeblich die Lebensbedingungen in den einzelnen Ghettos. Ausschlaggebend konnte in diesem Zusammenhang bereits der Ort der jeweiligen Unterbringung werden. Ob ein Ghetto innerhalb der Stadt in Wohnhäusern oder außerhalb der Ortschaft unter lagerähnlichen Bedingungen eingerichtet wurde, hatte auf den Ghettoalltag maßgeblich Einfluss. So berichtet zum Beispiel ein Überlebender aus Koscher, wo die jüdische Bevölkerung in der lokalen Ziegelei untergebracht wurde: Der Wind hat fürchterlich geblasen und es war kalt und die Ziegelei hatte nicht einmal Wände. Die ersten Tage waren furchtbar. Es gab keine Toilette, kein Wasser, keinen Platz, wo wir unser Gepäck hätten abladen können, wo wir uns hätten ausruhen können. Wir haben also angefangen zu arbeiten. Wir haben Wände erbaut, aber wir haben auf der Erde geschlafen. Wer konnte, beschaffte später Stroh. Die Menschen, die in eigens hierfür gekennzeichnete Häuser innerhalb der Stadt ziehen mussten, lebten unter verhältnismäßig besseren Bedingungen. Obwohl durchschnittlich 6 bis 7 Personen in einem Zimmer wohnen mussten, resümierte Überlebende: Hier war das Leben besser, weil sie in Wohnungen wohnen konnten, sie konnten sich freier bewegen und hin und wieder konnte der Mensch vielleicht für eine Minute auch mal alleine sein. Er musste nicht immer kollektiv denken, essen, trinken, schlafen. Insgesamt existierten 5 verschiedene Möglichkeiten, die Ghettoisierung in Ungarn umzusetzen. Hier sind einmal 4 aufgeführt. Die vollständige Aussiedlung, Unterbringung unter lagerähnlichen Bedingungen außerhalb der Wohnviertel in Fabriken und Wirtschaftsgebäuden. Zweitens die Unterbringung in abgeschlossene Wohnvierteln, oft im ehemaligen jüdischen Viertel. Drittens die Unterbringung in einzelnen, nicht unbedingt aneinander angrenzenden Gebäuden, die durch einen gelben Stern gekennzeichnet wurden. Und viertens Verzicht auf die Einrichtung eines abgeschlossenen Ghettos, also auch das kam in Ungarn vor. Und das Modell 5 stellt eine Kombination aus den Modellen 1 und 2 dar, wie sie zum Beispiel auch in Koscher bestanden, wo eben die einheimischen Juden der Stadt in einem abgeschlossenen Wohnviertel innerhalb der Stadt untergebracht wurden, während die jüdische Bevölkerung der Umgebung in Sammellagern ziehen musste, die sich meist am Stadtrand befanden. Dass die Frage, wo ein Ghetto eingerichtet wurde, in die Entscheidungsgewalt der jeweiligen Stadtverwaltung fiel, zeigt das Beispiel der Stadt Debrecen. Aus dem Protokoll der bereits anfangs zitierten Sitzung geht hervor, dass die Stadtverwaltung von Debrecen bei der Ghettoisierung zunächst die Idee verfolgt hatte, die Juden außerhalb der Stadt in eigens hierfür gebaute Baracken unterzubringen. Aber dieser Plan wurde aufgrund von fehlenden Baumaterialien bald verworfen und man entschied sich, 2 abgeschlossene Ghettos, ein kleines und ein großes Ghetto, in jenem Stadtteil einzurichten, das mehrheitlich von Juden bewohnt wurde. Damit folgte die Stadt Debrecen das Beispiel zahlreicher anderer Städte, wo sich die Bürgermeister ebenfalls bemüht hatten, die Juden in jenen Stadtteilen einzuquartieren, die ohnehin von Juden bewohnt waren, um möglichst wenige Umsiedlungen durchführen zu müssen und die Ghettoisierung schnell abschließen zu können. Dabei argumentierte der Bürgermeister von Debrecen auch damit, dass hier bereits auch Wasserleitungen und Kanalisation vorhanden wären. Wie viele andere Ghettos waren auch die Ghettos in Debrecen zunächst nicht hermetisch abgesperrt, sondern es bestand die Möglichkeit, sie für bestimmte Stunden zu verlassen. In einigen wenigen Ghettos erlaubte der örtliche Bürgermeister sogar das uneingeschränkte Verlassen des Ghettogeländes. Die Entscheidung der Beamten in Debrecen, das Verlassen des Ghettos zu genehmigen, fällte die Stadtverwaltung aber nicht ohne Einspruch. So sprach sich zum Beispiel der Stadtrat für technische Fragen für die Absperrung des Ghettos aus, weil in diesem Fall es von der Polizei besser kontrolliert werden könne. Der Bürgermeister verwies aber darauf, dass es diesbezüglich keine zentrale Regelung existiere und plädierte für ein offenes Ghetto, dessen Bevölkerung lediglich die Einschränkung erhält, den Markt nur zu vorgeschriebenen Zeiten aufzusuchen. Mit diesem Verweis, dass es keine zentrale Regelung gibt, das kommt in diesem Protokoll auch sehr oft, also noch öfters vor allem auch vom Bürgermeister aufgebracht. Und ich glaube, ist dann in diesem Zusammenhang eben auch nicht unwesentlich. Weiters stellte sich der Bürgermeister eben die Frage, wie kommt der Tagelöhner zur Arbeit, weil arbeiten muss man doch. Wie auch die Bürgermeister und Beamte vieler anderer Städte sah eben auch der Bürgermeister von Debrecen eine vorstehende Abschließung des Ghettos somit als problematisch an, da dadurch der Kriegswirtschaft wertvolle Arbeitskräfte verloren gegangen wären. Tatsächlich durften die Juden in einigen Ortschaften ihrer ursprünglichen Tätigkeit auch nach der Ghettoisierung nachgehen, was eben auch den dringenden Bedarf an Arbeitskräften verdeutlicht. Am deutlichsten wird diese Kontinuität in den medizinischen Berufen. So gestattete die Stadtverwaltung zum Beispiel vielen jüdischen Ärzten und Apotheker weiterhin die Ausübung ihres Berufs, so zum Beispiel auch in Debrecen. Die jüdischen Ärzte hier durften das Ghetto täglich verlassen und ihre Patienten besuchen. Und dies, obwohl das Behandeln von nichtjüdischen Personen, von nichtjüdischen Patienten für Juden ja formell untersagt war. Doch wurde diese Regelung in vielen Fällen aufgrund des Mangels an nichtjüdischen Fachkräften nicht eingehalten. Schließlich machten die jüdischen Ärzte in Ungarn mehr als die Hälfte der Ärzteschaft in Ungarn aus. Eine hermetische Abregelung des Ghettos in Debrecen betrachtete die Stadtverwaltung dabei auch aus dem Grund schwierig, da einige Häuser innerhalb des Ghettogeländes auch nach der Einrichtung des Ghettos von nichtjüdischen Personen bewohnt wurden. Im Protokoll hieß es dazu, die unter den Nummern 3 und 33 untergebrachten Bordelle kann man nirgendwo anders unterbringen. Die Bordelle haben eine spezielle Ausstattung, man kann sie nicht umsiedeln, das ist ein wichtiger Aspekt aus Gründen der Sicherheit. Das war die Meinung der Polizeichef der Stadt. Obwohl das Ghetto Debrecen nicht hermetisch abgeschlossen wurde, wurde das Gelände durch einen Holzzaun von der restlichen Stadt abgetrennt. Diese Maßnahme traf lediglich beim Bürgermeister der Stadt auf Ablehnung, aber auch er argumentierte hier nicht mit humanitären, sondern lediglich mit ästhetischen Gründen. Das zeigt auch, wie bürokratisch hier auch alles zuging. Er sagte, ein Holzzaun widerstrebt ihn. Erstens ist er hässlich, die Hauptstraße ist die Hauptstraße der Stadt. Zweitens benötigt man die Planken für die Ziele der Landesverteidigung. Zur Frage, ob jene Fenster, die auf die Straße schauen, eingemauert werden sollten, hieß es, ein längerer Ausschnitt aus diesem Protokoll, der Bürgermeister, die Fenster müssen ihre Bestimmung erfüllen, weil diese allgemeine sanitäre Lage erfordert. Man kann eine Wohnung nicht ohne Belüftung lassen. Daraufhin die Antwort des Stadtrates für technische Fragen. Die Sache kann so gelöst werden, dass man nur den oberen Teil des Fensters öffnen kann. Der untere Teil des Fensters muss verschlossen werden. Der Bürgermeister, es reicht, wenn die unteren Fensterscheiben abgeklebt werden. Das hat keine ernsthafte judenpolitische Bedeutung. Daraufhin der Gesundheitsinspektor. Aus den bereits existierenden Ghettos meldeten die führenden Personen, dass es aus Sicht der Gemeinschaft nicht wünschenswert ist, die Juden unentwegt zu sehen. Diskutiert wurde schließlich auch die Frage, wie viel Quadratmeter pro Person im Ghetto zur Verfügung gestellt werden sollte. Dem Vorschlag des Stadtrats für technische Fragen, 4 Quadratmeter pro Person bereitzustellen, lehnte der Gesundheitsinspektor mit den Worten ab, 4 Quadratmeter ist zu viel, im Mittäterschaft wohnen manche sogar auf dem Dachboden. Hier wird übrigens schon deutlich, wie auch an dem Zitat, der Gesundheitsinspektor hatte eben zuvor schon einige Inspektionsreisen in andere Ghettos gemacht und argumentierte immer wieder mit radikaleren Beispielen der Ghettoisierung. Tatsächlich stand in manchen Ghettos, vor allem in jenen in den annektierten Gebieten, durchschnittlich lediglich 1 Quadratmeter Fläche pro Person zur Verfügung. Im Großteil des Kernlandes waren dagegen 4 Quadratmeter pro Person die vorgesehene Norm, obwohl schließlich in vielen Ghettos eine Person mit etwa der Hälfte des Platzes auskommen musste. Auch in Debrecen schrumpfte der zur Verfügung stehende Platz mit der zunehmenden Überfüllung des Ghettos. Als Ende Mai, Anfang Juni das kleine Ghetto geschlossen wurde und seine Bewohner in das große Ghetto umgesiedelt wurden, wurde nicht nur der Platzmangel immer größer, sondern auch die Versorgung der jüdischen Bewohner zunehmend schwierig. Dabei waren die meisten auf die mitgebrachten Lebensmittel, Kleidung, Geld und Möbelstücke angewiesen, weil eben die Stadtverwaltung selbst sich nur bedingt um die Versorgung des Ghettos kümmerte. Bezüglich der Frage, was die jüdische Bevölkerung in das Ghetto mitnehmen darf, war sich die Stadtverwaltung bei ihrer Besprechung zunächst nicht einig. Hier nochmal ein längerer Ausschnitt aus dem Protokoll. Der Bürgermeister meinte hierzu, was dürfen Sie mitnehmen? Diesbezüglich gibt es keine Regelung. Der Obergespann daraufhin, bei der Sitzung am Donnerstag hatte der Obergespann die Information erhalten, dass sie 30 Penge Bargeld, 50 Kilo Gepäck und Lebensmittel für 14 Tage mitnehmen dürfen. Daraufhin der Stadtrat für technische Fragen. Liegeplatz sollte sie auf jeden Fall mitnehmen dürfen. Gesundheitsinspektor, in den von ihm inspizierten Ghettos hat es keine einheitliche Regelung gesehen. Es hing immer vom Kommandanten ab, was er in das Ghetto hineinließ. Es gab Ghettos, wo man nur ein Wechselpaar Unterwäsche mitnehmen durfte. Daraufhin der Bürgermeister, es ist eine Frage der öffentlichen Gesundheit, dass sie die nötigen Sachen mitnehmen dürfen. Der Obergespann, man muss in dieser Frage Staatssekretär Endre konsultieren, der eben für die antijüdische Maßnahmen auch zuständig war im Innenministerium unter anderem. Der Bürgermeister, sie sollen mitnehmen dürfen, was sie wollen, einen Schrank, 2 Betten, einen kleinen Tisch und daraufhin der Obergespann, das wäre dann wie eine Unterbringung in einem Erholungsheim. Es muss eine ausdrückliche Bestimmung herausgegeben werden, weil sonst es Chaos geben wird. Also wie hier deutlich wird, nahm der Bürgermeister der Stadt eine gemäßigtere Position ein. Vor allem der Gesundheitsinspektor argumentierte mit radikaleren Beispielen aus anderen Ghettos. Tatsächlich war die Praxis in den einzelnen Ghettos sehr unterschiedlich, wie auch in der Frage der Abgrenzung des Ghettos, völlige Isolierung versus offenes Ghetto, gab es auch hier 2 Extreme. In manchen Ghettos besaßen die Ghettobewohner lediglich die Kleidung, die sie am eigenen Leib trugen. In anderen durften sie mitnehmen, wie viel sie in ihrem neuen Wohnort sozusagen unterbringen konnten. Der Regelfall war aber, wie auch eben auch im Fall der Debrecen dann schließlich beschlossen, die 50 Kilo Gepäck. Einen Tag nach der Besprechung der Stadtverwaltung begann die Ghettoisierung der jüdischen Bevölkerung von Debrecen. Wie auch sonst überall in Ungarn führten die Internierungen die zuständigen Dienststellen der Polizei und der ungarischen Gendarmerie durch, wobei Vertreter des Sondereinsatzkommandos unter der Leitung von Adolf Eichmann als beratendes Organ stets anwesend waren. Die Juden der einzelnen Komitate hatten meist 3 bis 12 Tage Zeit, um in die gekennzeichneten Gebiete umzuziehen. In einigen Ortschaften ließ man ihnen hierzu jedoch nur wenige Stunden. In Munkac zum Beispiel entschieden sich die Behörden für eine Frist von 10 Stunden. Während den Ghettoisierungsmaßnahmen kam es zu unzähligen Misshandlungen und Plünderungen durch die ausführenden Organe, die nicht selten auch Todesopfer forderten. Besonders vielen Überlebenden blieben die Verhöre und die beschämenden Leibesvisitationen in Erinnerung, in deren Zusammenhang die Gendarmen und auch eigens hierfür bestellte Hebammen in allen Körperöffnungen nach versteckten Vermögenswerten suchten. Das Ghetto in Debrecen wurde am 20. Juni aufgelöst. Ihre Bewohner wurden in das nahegelegene Sammellager transportiert, das in einer Ziegelfabrik untergebracht wurde. Ende Juni deportierten die ungarischen Behörden in Zusammenarbeit mit der ungarischen Gendarmerie, Polizei und dem Sondereinsatzkommando schließlich den diesen Sammellager untergebrachten Personen nach Auschwitz-Birkenau bzw. nach Straßhof. Wie nun das Beispiel der Ghettoisierung eindrücklich zeigt, wäre die Zusammenfassung und Deportation der ungarischen Juden ohne die Kollaboration der ungarischen Behörden nicht möglich gewesen. Da die Konzentration und Deportation von mehr als 400.000 Juden binnen 8 Wochen von den schwachen deutschen Kräften nicht in einem solchen Ausmaß und in einer solchen Schnelligkeit durchgeführt werden konnte, musste die Ausarbeitung und Umsetzung der antijüdischen Maßnahmen in enger Zusammenarbeit mit den ungarischen Stellen erfolgen. Dabei hatte die ungarische Verwaltung wesentlichen Einfluss darauf, welche Lebensbedingungen in den jeweiligen Ghettos herrschten, indem sie Entscheidungen über den Ort der Unterbringung oder über die Höhe der mitgebrachten Lebensmittelrationen fällte. Ihr Handlungsspielraum ging sogar so weit, dass an manchen Ortschaften eine Ghettoisierung ganz verhindert werden konnte, wie eben auch einige lokale Beispiele beweisen. Dabei wurde ihr Spielraum durch das Fehlen von konkreten zentralen Regelungen erweitert. Aber statt entradikalisierend zu wirken, orientierten sich zahlreiche Beamte an radikalen Beispielen der Ghettoisierung, wie auch das Beispiel des Gesundheitsinspektors der Stadt Debrecen zeigt. Ob die Ghettoisierung radikaleren oder weniger radikalen Beispielen folgte, hatte auf die Verhältnisse im Ghetto wesentlichen Einfluss. Und unter welchen Umständen die deportierten Personen die Wochen vor der Deportation verbracht hatten, konnte schließlich an der Rampe von Auschwitz-Birkenau lebensentscheidend werden. Vielen Dank.
Thank you. I must start with a sort of apology because when I submitted the proposal of my today's talk, I was hoping to collect or to be granted an access to some important material that would help me to answer my research questions. As it happened, I didn't get the access, or I got a kind of partial access to that material, and what I eventually received doesn't allow me to answer my questions. However, I still hope that the questions are sufficiently important, and I may try to provide you some suggestions regarding the way they may be answered, but that is going to be rather conjectural. My first question was actually dealing with the extent to which local Polish population collaborated with the Nazis regarding the Roma genocide. At the first glance, it seems that the level of collaboration in this respect was much lower than the collaboration regarding the Holocaust, regarding the murdering of Jews. I received 25 lengthy testimonies recorded in various periods by various people, which are now stored in the Roma Historical Institute, which is a part of the Association of Roma People in Poland, with its headquarters in the town of Święcim, better known under the German name Auschwitz. According to these 25 lengthy testimonies, the Polish collaboration was practically minimal. There are only 2 instances mentioned in these 25 recollections. Both instances of collaboration mentioned are coming from relatively well-integrated Roma people who lived in bigger towns and were relatively better off than the rest of the Roma population. The 2 authors of those testimonies claim that their families were arrested because of being Roma, and that the knowledge that they are Roma had been passed to the Germans by their Polish neighbors. However, they both claim at the same time that that was rather a material ground for that kind of reporting, because they were better off, and probably the neighbors expected sort of a chance to get richer when the Roma families are arrested. If this is true, that the local collaboration regarding Roma was less important than the one regarding Jews, we may ask the question why. Well, first of all, we may try to answer this question by referring to the very inconsistent Nazi policy regarding Roma, especially in the General Gouvernement and in the southern, what is today southern Poland. By late 1942, the German occupying forces were not very much concerned with the local Polish Roma population. They were rather busy with the German Roma and Sinti deported to the occupied Poland in the spring of 1940. The authorities of the General Gouvernement were not very happy about those deportees. They perceived that as a kind of an administrative burden, especially that no detailed instructions followed the deportations. Therefore, they had to arrange something for the deportees, but they didn't know exactly what is expected from them. So they somehow put them under control, used them as a slave labor, and in this capacity they survived until 1943, when they were murdered in the series of summary executions. However, until that time, the authorities were rather busy with the German Roma and Sinti, and were not particularly hunting for the local Polish Roma. So even if there were people who would like to collaborate regarding the Roma genocide, there was not exactly an institution with whom they could collaborate at that time. Secondly, we may mention here that the image of Roma in a Polish society was much different than the image of the Jew. The image of the Jew was seriously influenced by anti-Semitism, and it was, by and large, a negative picture, while the stereotype of Roma was rather ambiguous. That was an image in which positive and negative elements were mixed. There is no open hostility on the part of the Polish population regarding Roma. Well, thirdly, we may also say that the material benefits that the local Poles could get, in their opinion, by collaborating regarding Roma genocide were not as big as they expected could be their gain in case of the reporting the Jews. And finally, we must also say that Roma didn't depend that much from the on the local population, on the support of the local population. Roma were relatively independent. They could survive outside of the inhabited areas. They could survive in forests. They could provide, they could manage to arrange food and shelter without asking the Polish population. Therefore, they were not that much vulnerable and dependent. Now, jumping from the analysis of the testimonies to the analysis of the case studies of the actual acts of collaboration that started to be more frequent in that region, I mean southern Poland, in the end of 1942 and beginning of 1943, I think I could distinguish three levels of collaboration. And the first I would call complicity. That is the actual participation in mass murder. This is that form of collaboration that was represented by the units of the Polish police, the so-called blue police, who assisted German gendarmerie in killing Roma, but also arranged such executions on their own. They were guarding and transporting the victims and also safeguarding the areas of execution. They were complicit. The second level of collaboration I would call cooperation, and this is an attitude represented mostly by the local Polish administration, by the village councils and their heads who were watching the movements of Roma groups, reporting on them, and providing, for instance, men or wagons with horses to transport those Roma groups who were caught in the area. The third level is involvement. Here I mean those regular villagers who were working as coachmen or who were forced to dig graves to bury the corpses, but also regular witnesses. However, when we are talking about witnesses, we must also differentiate different forms of being a witness. Here I want to refer to Paul Shapiro's opening remarks. There may be forced bystanders, those who are watching the crime against their will and with a sense of horror, and there may be willing bystanders, to use Goldhagen's term of willing executioners, I think we may also speak of willing bystanders, those who want to watch, those who show no compassion and who even may find it sort of entertaining, however brutal it sounds. So these all versions of being a bystander could happen there in that area. Since I'm probably having 5 minutes, no more, 10, good. I would also say that the attitude towards Roma is not, let's say, homogenic. It depends on what kind of Roma group we are dealing with. In 1942 and 1943, in the area that I studied, there were 3 groups of Roma, and they were different. So first of all, there was a group of the so-called Carpathian Roma, settled for centuries and very well integrated with the local village population, including mixed marriages. The second group, there were German Sinti and Roma deported in 1940, with whom local villagers practically had no contact. And finally, the third group, there were nomadic groups of Polish and sometimes Hungarian Roma who were passing through villages. I would say that the attitude of the local villagers towards Roma depended very much, which particular group they were dealing with. Regarding the settled Carpathian Roma, they could probably be involved and sometimes cooperate during the mass executions. However, they were not doing this very willingly. These Carpathian Roma were perceived as our Roma, those who are familiar, who belong to us. Quite a different situation was with the German Sinti and with the nomadic groups. Here, I would say the attitude was rather ranging from cooperation to complicity. And many cases actually confirmed that. However, not all of them. There is one interesting case of a village southwest of Tarnów in which the local council received an order to select 10 young people to be sent to Germany as slave labor. The council had a meeting and they agreed that instead of sending Polish villagers, they could arrest people from the local Roma settlement. So they formed a sort of a village militia. They went to the settlement and they arrested 12 people. 12 people, they put them in the school building, locked them there and called for the unit of the Blue Police. When the Blue Police arrived, there was a fight, in the result of which one Roma person was murdered, 2 escaped, the rest were taken and transported to Germany. This case actually contradicts my hypothesis that our Roma were protected. That was precisely the case of complicity in the persecution of the local settled Roma population. So I'm just telling you this as an example of how difficult it is to make any generalization here. The second case is even more difficult. In July 1942, a group of 30 Roma people, mostly children, was spotted near the village of Bożęcin. They were taken to the forest nearby and shot with the participation of German gendarmes and the Polish Blue Police. That's it. However, when we are looking closely into the situation, there are several questions. For instance, did the Poles participate in killing? There are 3 testimonies coming from the eyewitnesses. 2 of them make very clear that the Polish members of the Blue Police were killing Roma, only less efficiently because they had simple rifles and the gendarmes, German gendarmes, had submachine guns. There is one testimony, however, that claims that there were only Germans murdering Roma. Now, the most interesting thing is that these testimonies I'm talking about are coming from the 1990s and were recorded by the local journalists. These three people had testified 20 years earlier for the National Committee for Investigating Nazi Crimes in Poland, and three testimonies that they gave at that time, in 1970s, make no mention whatsoever about Polish participation in the event. So that is, I think, very significant and tells us that when we are studying sources related to the collaboration in this field, we must take into account that it's very important when they were produced and on which occasion. I would say that if we take it into account, we should be much more critical regarding the value of those sources, and probably in the course of time, especially now when the issue of the Roma genocide becomes important and studied, we will have to revise our knowledge by changing our approach to the existing sources. Thank you.
1 week after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, non-Jewish Lithuanians living in the small riverside town of Jurbarkas forcibly assembled the community's Jewish men and led them to the riverbanks for what Kanye Goldman, then a Jewish resident of the town, would later liken to a funeral. And I quote, "Lithuanian partisans selected Jewish men and forced them to go to the synagogue and study house. They forced the men to carry out of the synagogue the plank on which corpses are taken to be buried. Then they forced a young man from Jurbarkas, the wig maker Yitzchok Kopelevich, to lie down on the plank with a Torah scroll in his arms. Several men bore the plank. After marching down the main street, the funeral was led to the banks of the Nieman, where all participants were forced into the water. The partisans forced the Jews to throw the living corpse and the Torah scroll deep into the river and then pretend to drown them." End quote. Most of the men who suffered through this performance did not live to see the end of the war. On either July 10th or 11th, 1941, local auxiliaries shot approximately 550 Jewish men at an unspecified location outside of town. This paper seeks to connect the collaboration of non-Jewish Lithuanians in mass murder during the late summer and autumn of 1941 to earlier episodes of highly ritualized yet seldom murderous violence. Remarkably, while a handful of historians, including Helmut Walser-Smith, had made overtures towards such a study with this approach, the phenomenon of violent performance rituals during World War II and the Holocaust remains relatively understudied. In this respect, rituals of humiliation provide a missing link. Publicly staged performances, similar to the one described before, paved the way for local collaboration by violently excluding Jewish communities from the universe of human obligation. These degrading rituals demonstrated to German officials that the Jewish question could be solved creatively and without much input from above by local Lithuanians. The Shoah in provincial Lithuania was largely an indigenous affair whose impetus, at least in part, surged from below at a grassroots level. Using a cluster of as yet scarcely examined survivor testimonies collected in the immediate post-war period by Leib Konikovsky, this conference paper undertakes two related projects. First, a careful examination of the phenomenon of ritualized violence from the perspective of Jewish survivors. Second, and in light of such rituals, a reconsideration of collaboration in the Holocaust in three rural Lithuanian counties, Telge, Razene, and Toraj. Religious anti-Semitism, not just official German policies or highly stylized German stereotypes of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, permeated the countryside during the weeks after the invasion. The acts of ritualized degradation cited in this paper suggest that, alongside the more frequently cited myth of Shudo Komuna, there also lurked a deep undercurrent of religious anti-Semitism. But more. The post-war testimonies examined here powerfully demonstrate, as do many more of the testimonies gathered by Konikovsky, that local Lithuanians carried out a vast majority of the killings that transpired in this region, albeit under German supervision. Let us return to the incident in Jurbarkas. While the mock funeral procession described by Goldman transpired along the riverbanks, across town, other Lithuanians stormed into Jewish households, tore down the mezuzahs with their bayonets, and forced the Jews to carry prayer shawls and books to a designated spot. Once the Lithuanians felt satisfied that enough religious artifacts had been assembled, they defiled the Torah scrolls and other materials of Jewish worship. The actions of non-Jewish Lithuanians succeeded in humiliating and terrorizing the Jews of Jurbarkas, who later returned to their homes that night in despair. When Goldman later described these events to Konikovsky, she did so in a tone of almost utter mystification. From her perspective, there appears to have been no discernible impetus for or underlying structure to the ritual. This is entirely understandable. One could hardly expect for victims of such a traumatic event to make use or to make sense of the proceedings in any way other than as an outburst of useless violence. Survivor testimony from Jurbarkas challenges the oft-cited historiographical narrative in which the highly politicized myth of a Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy incited outbursts of localized violence in collaboration with the Germans during the Holocaust. Such testimonies, replete with references to baptism, the forced drowning of Jewish men, and traumatic desecrations of Jewish religious artifacts, suggests a more archaic, even folkloric religious dimension to early instances of anti-Jewish violence in provincial Lithuania. Indeed, the very specter of Charlemagne driving the conquered Saxons into the river and then pronouncing them Christian haunts the performances that took place in Jurbarkas on that day. Although this underlying trope might not have been intelligible to the Jewish victim, such a subtext would have been available to almost any Christian bystander. And for any individual straddling the fence on the issue of the Jewish question, such a performance, laden as it was with familiar anti-Semitic rather than Judeo-Bolshevik motifs, would have gone a long way toward legitimizing the shootings that followed. A minute. Sorry. The day's events in Jurbarkas also helped to convince German soldiers that local Lithuanians could be entrusted with considerable responsibility in matters concerning the Jewish question. One woman, referred to only as Mrs. Berzaner in the text of Goldman's post-war testimony, was tossed into a wheelbarrow and carted to the banks of the Niemann, where partisans then beat her. Thus demoralized, Berzaner turned to an unlikely source for protection, and I quote, "The woman spotted a German officer and ran up to him. She threw herself to her knees and then begged him to shoot her. The officer declared that he couldn't do that because authority over the Jews had been placed in the hands of the Lithuanians." This testimony raises an interesting point. According to German documents discovered after the war, the Nazis apparently went to great lengths to portray pogroms as spontaneous outbursts of localized aggression. Yet if we agree to take the post-war testimony of Jewish survivors seriously, then we must also concede the possibility that locals did in fact organize and carry out violent pogroms against their neighbors without much input from above. Consider the broader circumstances of Goldman's anecdote. When she delivered her post-war testimony, she could not have been aware of the internal Nazi circulars that called for the concealment of German responsibility. Indeed, Goldman had every reason to tell the truth when she characterized local authority over the Jews as being in the hands of the Lithuanians. German officers had just as many reasons to lie. Based on the wealth of testimonial evidence furnished by Jewish survivors, it appears plausible that Germans preferred to take credit for such events in their reports back to Berlin, while in reality their role in early acts of persecution perhaps was rather minimal. To thicken the picture, let us consider another example. In Laukiva, locals rounded up their Jewish neighbors and herded them into the cramped quarters of the town's Jewish study house. Confined like chattel, the Jewish community suffered the indignity of providing entertainment to peasants from the surrounding countryside who arrived on market day to witness the spectacle. Here, the humiliation assumed a less ritualistic but no less demeaning form, physically separating the Jewish community from their Gentile counterparts and treating them as livestock allowed locals to symbolically separate their Jewish neighbors from the universe of human obligation. Although such evidence points to an extensive Lithuanian role in the orchestration of public performance rituals, on occasion Germans did participate. Thus, Zender Linkemer, a survivor from the small town of Kaltenenje, recalled one incident in which a German officer, identified only as SS Sturmführer Dr. Schau, first humiliated, then tortured, and finally shot to death the town rabbi. According to Linkemer, Schau tossed the rabbi and a Torah scroll into a bomb crater, whereupon a group of Germans burned the rabbi's beard and sidelocks with lit candles, and then burned his Torah scroll. After torturing the rabbi for several more minutes, he was shot and left to die at the bottom of the crater. In addition to demonstrating the presence of religiously inflected anti-Semitic tropes, the Leib-Konikovsky papers also reflect both the broad participation of locals in the annihilation of Lithuanian Jewry, as well as the extent to which collaborators proactively intuited and then acted upon the wishes of their German overseers. On August 29, 1941, Chaim Goldstein and a handful of Jewish men were led out into the courtyard of Erzvilkas at the behest of armed partisans. Hoping to terrorize their captives, some of the partisans fired shots into the night sky. What transpired next suggests the Lithuanian partisans actively interpreted the wishes of their German commanders and then constructed a situation in which those desires might be acted upon. And I quote, "Hearing the two shots, two Germans came to the courtyard to investigate. A partisan, son of a colonel and President Smetonas's army, explained to the Germans that the Jews had shot 3 Lithuanians and they had to pay with their lives. The Germans were outraged and permitted the Jews to be taken away to be shot." According to Goldstein, only a last-minute appeal to the Germans, apparently mounted by the targeted Jews themselves, prevented the planned shooting from happening. As with earlier outbursts of violence, which this paper characterizes as having emerged largely from indigenous wellsprings of religious anti-Semitism, the above anecdote would suggest that locals were entirely capable of proactively intuiting the desires of their German overseers. Local intuition and initiative with respect to Nazi Jewish policy extended to the extermination process itself. According to Dina Koropotkin, a survivor from Toraj, Germans standing alongside a death pit simply watched the Lithuanians without participating. When a young woman approached a German soldier with offers to work in exchange for the preservation of her life, the soldier reportedly responded, "We're not shooting anyone. You see who's doing the shooting." In the Grybaukie forest on September 15th, 71 Lithuanians took part in the extermination of more than 1,500 Jews, compared to only 3 Germans. According to secondary accounts, the 3 Germans merely took pictures and watched as Lithuanians snapped small children on their knees and then threw them half dead into the pit. Others were tossed headfirst against tree stumps and then dropped into the pit. The post-war testimony of Malka Gilis and Kanye Peltz, survivors from Telze, succinctly captures, I think, the degree of Lithuanian participation in such shootings. After Christmas 1941, there were 75 women in the Telz prison who had been captured in the villages and forests. They too were taken to the Rene forest and shot. No Germans were seen. Everything was carried out by Lithuanians. In the middle of town squares, under the watchful eyes of local partisans and sometimes Germans, non-Jewish Lithuanians forced their Jewish neighbors to perform humiliating rituals designed to demonstrate and demean their faith. In this way, I would argue that the ritualized humiliation of rural Jews in Lithuania served a familiar and similar function to the useless violence described by Primo Levi in his eponymous essay, useless violence which he defines as having 2 purposes, not only the degradation of the victim, but also the goal of attenuating the sense of guilt registered by the perpetrator. During the first weeks after the German invasion, Lithuanians enacted rituals of public humiliation, not only for the simple purpose of degrading or even winning the confidence of German overseers, in order to justify the brutal physical persecution of Jewish victims, both in their own eyes and those of their neighbors. Lithuanian collaborators first had to expel their victims symbolically and through violent rituals designed for public consumption from the universe of human obligation. Physically expelling Jewish men, women, and children from the universe of obligation worked to justify later actions. For conclusion, to this point, I focused upon the challenges that ritual violence might impose upon the existing historiographical literature. However, I would be remiss if I did not conclude with a broader argument about the value of the Leib-Konikovsky papers for future historical study. Until recently, scholars of the final solution have viewed post-war survivor testimonies with some skepticism, preferring to reconstruct the past using sources left behind by others. On one level, this reticence makes sense. As Christopher Browning recently observed, in a field as emotionally freighted as Holocaust history, many historians have simply refrained from drawing upon survivor accounts, lest the resulting study draw criticism for questioning the moral or factual authority of the survivor. Yet without the testimonies collected by Leib Koniakowski, the history of the Holocaust in provincial Lithuania loses much of its clarity. To ensure this is not the case, we must listen carefully to the words of survivors. For these men and women, the process of destruction began when the rituals of humiliation suffered at the hands of their Lithuanian neighbors tore apart the fragile bonds of a common humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for this very interesting set of papers. We will now open the floor for discussion. We have until the coffee break at 4 o'clock. Please wait for the microphone to ask your question, and also please do introduce yourself to the group. Thanks. Doris.
Doris Bergen, University of Toronto. Thanks also for this very interesting papers. And I wondered whether this session might not have been called something about different kinds of sources for study of collaboration, because I was really struck by the really different kinds and readings of sources. I guess I have two questions, one for Fielder and one for Filip. And maybe I'll start with the question for you. We recently had a conference in Toronto about the Holocaust in Lithuania, and there was a very interesting debate between Sarah Genaita, herself a survivor from Lithuania and also an author, and Krzysztof Diekman, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with. And it was precisely about the involvement of Germans in the early pogroms. And no one would deny, and I think certainly both of them agreed, that the impulse from the Germans was very important. But for Sarah Genaita, it was absolutely essential to insist that there were pogroms before the Germans arrived. So, right, in days of June, before the arrival of the Germans, this was absolutely essential. And there certainly is evidence that she could bring for that, almost all of it from survivor and also contemporary victim evidence. And for Krzysztof Diekman, it was really important to insist that those early incidents were very minor in terms of numbers of casualties, and that it was really the arrival of the Germans that made the big difference. So first, I'm curious what you think about that argument. And second, if you take Diekman's position, how does that affect the argument that you've just presented to us? Because you suggest that this, excess violence, ritual humiliation was about conditioning Lithuanians themselves, but you also hint in your paper that it demonstrated to the Germans that they were willing. So how much German, witness was there? And then my question for you, very, very interesting to look at those petitions. And it struck me, though, that, there's a lot of work being done on petitions in other contexts, right? I thought about Thomas Pegalo-Kaplan's work in Germany, Golfo Alexopoulos and other people who've looked at the Soviet Union. And it seemed to me, to my reading, that your reading of the petitions was kind of idiosyncratic, right? To read the petitions as evidence of a wider spread popular support of the Ustasha, I wondered about that. And I wondered whether the binary that you drew between understanding the petitions as, your word, opportunistic attempts to save oneself, if those are the only two possibilities, maybe what's interesting about these petitions is precisely what they show, that kinds of complex, multiple identities that were quite logical and possible before 1941 or 1939, or depending, where you are, become bizarre seeming and illogical after the fact. But perhaps you're reading backwards, to think of these petitions as somehow something sort of strange that must either be a sign of acceptance or of opportunistic manipulation. Maybe they're a sign that these multiple identities were actually quite available to people then, but they're no longer available after the fact, even as scholars.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. To answer your question, I guess you had two different questions. The first one is really easy. I think I would side with Professor Diekmann on this one. And then listening to your summary of his assessment and his conversation, if you will, about the importance of the arrival of the Germans versus indigenous anti-Semitism, I think I would probably just say that what we have here, I would not mean to imply that there was some deep-seated wish, some kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism that only needed to be released after the German arrival. I think what you have instead is a case in which there is this kind of autochthonous or multiple local discourses that are anti-Jewish that then in 1941, after the German invasion, would feed into a broader trajectory of Nazi rhetoric, of which the final solution, first deportation, then selective killings, then mass extermination, played a very integral role. But I think that I would agree, we discussed earlier in this same panel, and you asked the question about where these sorts of issues, where collaboration might fit, and where anti-Semitism might fit on the rubric of what it meant to collaborate with the Nazi regime. And I think that in this case, you simply have local contexts and local situations that feed into this much broader system in 1941. So I guess if that's, I'm sure we can talk about it later too, but that's roughly speaking where I would sit.
I would agree with your comments. Maybe, we shouldn't be compelled to categorize these in this way. And I especially would like to highlight the kind of post-Habsburg setting for these, because I couldn't include, obviously, all the petitions here, but there's many coming from veterans of World War I that, aren't too sure about racial national projects, but are saying, after all, I did shoot 20 Serbs in 1914. Why can't I, be part of this? And stuff like that. So the complicated identities are very much a part of the first chapter of my dissertation that we can talk about.
Next, I think there's a question from Paul Shapiro.
Thank you. Paul Shapiro from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Each one of you has presented a case as if it was a case in isolation, a local study. And often enough, conclusions drawn on a single case study turn out to have weaknesses. So I wonder if one of you or all of you could talk about other cases where you tested to see if the same pattern might apply. And I'll just toss out one example that you didn't give, so there would be yet another one. In the Romanian case, where there's been a lot of study recently, there's very clear documentation of the Romanians recruiting locals from Bessarabia before the re-invasion of Bessarabia by the Romanians to go into villages. And the documentation absolutely resonates with this idea of before the Germans arrived. To go into villages, stir things up, so that the work is already done before Romanian forces arrive. And it's not a military action that's taking place. They have found a way to tell people in those localities, now is the moment, do what you want, take what you want. You won't be punished, you'll be rewarded, in fact. Or the differentiation among Roma, very similar attitudes to these categories in the Romanian case. It becomes official policy in Romania to make those differentiations and distinctions. I guess I'm looking for an effort to go beyond the individual geographic case study of one place to see if we can identify certain patterns, and perhaps to see if we can identify the initiative towards certain patterns based on success or failure in one place, of which a new regime or a new ally or a recently occupied country says, well, this works, and so let's do that. We've seen that it works, rather than seeing each case as a lone example and trying to draw a conclusion for each individual case. So I'm just looking to see where you've tested the conclusions that you're drawing about your individual cases, beyond the individual case itself.
Okay, I'm afraid I'm not able to answer the question the way you'd like to, but I think I may criticize the way you ask the question, because I have a feeling that at least regarding the Roma genocide, it's very difficult to speak about the general pattern of the genocide itself, not to say a word about the general pattern of collaboration. Therefore, it may happen that the only thing that we can achieve would be a set of case studies, which is fine with me because I'm a social anthropologist. I'm not searching for sweeping generalizations. You mentioned Romania. This is a very difficult case because, well, I interviewed many Romanian Roma regarding their memories, and they are split. There is a cleavage, and there is no single community of memory. There are people for whom the period of the Second World War is associated with the deportations to Transnistria, with hunger, with death. And there are people who, at exactly in the same time, were fighting in Eastern Front in the Romanian army, hand in hand with other Romanians and with the German Wehrmacht. And they are very proud of that, and they mentioned this as the first step towards their integration to the Romanian society. Of course, there were instances of collaboration. Of course, there were similarities, but differences are too important to be simply, glossed over. And I think that it still doesn't mean that it wasn't a genocide. It was a genocide, but inconsistent, decentered and desynchronized, because in different periods of time there were different mechanisms used. And maybe this is the most terrifying piece of knowledge we can get from studying the Roma genocide, that genocide can happen in such a way, disorganized way. That's what I want to say.
Zu Ungarn gibt es an und für sich schon einige Untersuchungen über die Ghettoisierungen. Und dieser Vielschichtigkeit, um die es mir in diesem Vortrag auch ging, in den einzelnen Modellen, um auch sozusagen auf diese Weise auch aufzuzeigen, wie viel Handlungsspielraum sozusagen auch gegeben hat. Und da ist natürlich dieses Protokoll, das ich hier vorgestellt habe, einfach ein ganz besonderes Dokument, weil es sehr, sehr wenige solche Protokolle überhaupt erhalten geblieben sind. Und das war auch der Grund, wieso ich den ausgewählt habe und sozusagen auch an einem konkreten Beispiel das jetzt da zeigen wollte. Aber ich habe versucht, ich hoffe, das ist auch rübergekommen, das in einen größeren Kontext, also zumindest jetzt bezogen auf Ungarn zu stellen. Natürlich wäre auch ein internationaler Vergleich, die man wahrscheinlich im Rahmen dieses Tagung eben auch diskutieren muss, auch vielleicht dann zum Abschluss zusammenfassen.
Okay, I think there were a couple of questions. I think Imke Hansen and Natalia Election had questions. Maybe we'll take those two at once again. Yeah.
So Natalia Election, I think it might actually be on Saturday that we might have some answers to the comparative perspective. One thing that to me, and it's not necessarily a question for answer, but one way of looking maybe would be the provincial perspective vis-à-vis the large urban centers. And Sławomir, you mentioned those two cases that are quite different from the small town or village. In your case, is entirely small provincial scenario. So just a thought, and then a question to your paper. How I'm puzzled, because what you describe is extremely similar to Eastern Galicia. So there is already that discussion of two localities. But to what extent there is a pre-war presence in Jewish testimonies of that repertoire of religious anti-Semitism? I mean, cutting off beards and side locks, and this did not happen in summer of 41 for the first time. It escalated, but how do they remember the pre-war vis-a-vis what happens in a summer?
That's a good question. I think that a lot of the testimonies, because of the nature of their construction and then because of the nature of the subject that they're talking about in their testimonies, have a kind of significant slant toward the war years. Now, every testimony that was collected by Koniuszowski began with an account of the pre-war period. But most of the time, the descriptions are either, well, most of the time they're very general in one of two directions. Either their neighbors are anti-Semites who are simply lusting for an opportunity to murder their Jewish neighbors and take their money or to take their houses, or the pre-war situation was ostensibly good and the town in question looked peaceable enough. And then the resulting testimony is often registered in terms of trauma and shock. Not only that the entire community was exterminated, but that this could have happened at all, when in fact we do know that there were problems in the interwar period. I mean, when I was thinking about case studies that describe things like ritualized beatings or the cutting of locks of hair, I finished reading earlier this summer The Butcher's Tale by Helmut Walser-Smith, which describes in many respects a very similar outburst of ritualized violence. In fact, that's one of his central arguments. And the difference, of course, is that took place in Könitz, in the German Empire, in 1900, not in Lithuania in 1941. So, yes, you're right, there were plenty of tensions in the interwar period, but the extent to which those were effaced in the process of re-narrating the past to Leib Koniuszowski in 1948 or 49 often worked to efface that tension, if that makes sense.
Imke Hansen, Hugo Valentin Center Uppsala. Ich habe eine Frage an Sławomir und zwei Fragen an Regina. Erstmal Regina vielleicht. Du hast ja sehr klar gemacht, diesen Handlungsspielraum, den die lokale Gruppe da hatte und dass die auch durchaus nach Beispielen in anderen Regionen geguckt haben und sich spannenderweise jeweils eher an der radikaleren Version orientiert haben. Ich habe zwei Fragen dazu, nämlich einmal, gab es eine Art von Erfahrungsaustausch zwischen verschiedenen Regionen? Gab es da meinetwegen Treffen von Bürgermeistern oder diesen technischen Beauftragten, von denen du da gesprochen hast? Oder war das schriftliche Kommunikation? Also woher hatten die jeweils die Informationen aus den anderen Gebieten? Wie war da sozusagen das Networking unter den lokalen Kollaborateuren in den verschiedenen Bezirken in Ungarn? Ich frage das deshalb, weil für mein Forschungsgebiet, also Belarus und Ukraine, RKU und also die verschiedenen Verwaltungseinheiten, unterscheidet sich das wirklich auch von Dorf zu Dorf ganz, ganz stark, auf welche Weise da der Handlungsspielraum genutzt wurde. Und die zweite Frage war, bei dieser Diskussion, was jetzt mit den Fenstern geschieht und so weiter, wo es immer stark um das Gemeinwohl, also das ethnisch-ungarische Gemeinwohl geht, da hört sich das für mich so an, als wären die der Meinung gewesen, die Ghettos würden länger bestehen. Nun haben die Ghettos in der Ukraine ja vergleichsweise kurz bestanden. Inwieweit gab es da schon das Wissen über die Zeit, die Ghettos überhaupt bestehen werden? Und meine Frage an Sławomir ist, im Zuge der Vorbereitung dieser Konferenz, also meines Vortrags, bin ich auf ein Interview gestoßen mit einem Roma, der befragt zu lokaler Kollaboration, ich glaube in der Ukraine oder in Belarus, bin ich gerade nicht so sicher, sagt, er will nicht darüber sprechen und auch da wird weiter gefragt und ganz vehement sagt nein und er will nicht darüber sprechen, also er wollte explizit nichts über die lokale Bevölkerung sagen. Und mein erster Gedanke dazu war, weil vor dem Hintergrund von meinen Interviews mit Roma in Belarus, dass die einfach um der eigenen Integration in die Community willen halt wirklich ganz stark sich von diesen Themen also da raushalten. Aber ich habe keine anderen Vergleichsfälle. Insofern wollte ich dich um Rat fragen, wie sieht das in deinen Samples aus? Was gibt es da eben diese Verweigerung, über lokale Kollaboration zu sprechen, so explizit? Danke.
Ja, vielen Dank, Imke, für die Fragen. Ich finde, das sind ganz, ganz interessante auch Anregungen auch für weiterführende Forschungsprojekte. Gerade auch diese Frage der Netzwerke ist ganz spannend. An und für sich gab es jetzt gerade auch von zentraler Ebene auf jeden Fall Treffen. Und zum Beispiel dieser Gesundheitsinspektor, der hier immer wieder mit anderen Beispielen argumentiert, sagt auch, dass er auch Inspektionsreisen in andere Ghettos unternommen hat. Also es gab solche Reisen sozusagen, wo man dann angeschaut hat, wie das Ghettoleben in anderen Ghettos organisiert wird. Wie ich schon am Anfang des Vortrages erwähnt habe, wurden die Ghettos nämlich phasenweise eingerichtet. Also nicht alle auf einmal, sondern zuerst in den annektierten Gebieten und dann in dem Kernland nach Gendarmeriedistrikten geordnet. Und dadurch hatte man sozusagen, gerade wenn man in einem anderen Distrikt gewohnt hat, wo die Ghettoisierung später anfing, Bezugspunkte und Beispiele, an die man sich orientieren konnte. Und es war auch die Zeitungsberichterstattung an und für sich über die Ghettoisierung ziemlich sichtbar. Das heißt, auch da konnte man sich informieren. Aber es wäre auf jeden Fall interessant, wie weit das sozusagen nach unten geht, gerade dieser Informationsaustausch. Zur Frage, wie lange diese Ghettos bestanden, beziehungsweise was die Menschen schon wussten, wie lange sie bestehen werden. An und für sich, wie auch einzelne Ghettos zeigen, wurden die unter sehr, sehr provisorischen Umständen eingerichtet. Also es gab teilweise auch, obwohl hier in Debrecen eben der Bürgermeister mit der Kanalisation und mit Wasserleitung zum Beispiel argumentiert, gab es Ortschaften, wo die Ghettos an Orten eingerichtet wurden, wo das überhaupt nicht vorhanden war. Also insofern hat man teilweise damit gerechnet, dass die örtliche Bevölkerung bald deportiert wird, aber das war nicht überall so. Es gab auch Ortschaften, wo man davon ausging, dass man hier auch länger eingerichtet bleibt, jetzt auch von der Stadtverwaltungsseite her und auch von den jüdischen Ghettobewohnern, die auch teilweise davon ausgingen, dass sie hier sozusagen für längere Zeit jetzt bleiben werden.
Okay, thank you for this question. This is actually something really important and contributes to the idea of criticizing sources, even if there are, for instance, oral testimonies of the survivors. We must be critical regarding their testimony as well, and the process of silencing and erasing certain parts of memory is indeed well advanced among those Roma communities that I studied. And I think that we may talk about at least three types of silences. The one is that you actually suggested. This is the problem of the necessity of living together with the perpetrators, because most of the Eastern European Roma survivors remained in Eastern Europe and lived together with the perpetrators. They had to establish some sort of the way of dealing with one another, modus operandi of the future coexistence. And of course, to remind what they did to us, so to speaking, was not rational in this context. In many ways, some people whom I interviewed explicitly told me that they don't want to mention this in order not to give some illustrations of what can be done to Roma in future, because they still perceive the threat, they still perceive that there are persecuted on the racist basis, and that the images of the Second World War, the images of genocide, could serve as a catalyst for contemporary nationalist, right-wing, anti-Roma movements. So that's one thing. The second reason would be ideological, and this is especially important in the countries that you mentioned, Ukraine or Belarus, or in Poland as well. It means the countries that developed an ideology of moral purity. Poland, the country without Kisling, as it was mentioned, or Ukraine and Belarus, the brave partisans, resistance. So having that ideology from above, it was very difficult to subvert it by, let's say, advancing an alternative narrative in which the brave partisans or the brave Polish Christians who rejected the Nazi terror could turn out to be actually collaborators. So that had to wait. That's why now we have some testimonies and not before. And eventually in some more traditional communities there was also a cultural ground for that. Something what we may call an attempt to save face, or to conspiracy to save face. In many traditional Roma communities you would find that they prefer to talk about fight or success, escape, survival, life. They don't want to mention instances in which actually they happen to be persecuted. That involves collaboration as well, because in the traditional worldview of those communities, the world is clearly divided into the sphere of ours, Roma world, and the sphere of them, non-Roma, the Gadzie. And the Gadzie can never harm the internal Roma world, which is protected by the boundaries of traditional culture. If it happened that they in fact did harm that culture, that had to be silenced in order to save the picture of the universe that their vision of themselves was based on. Thank you.
So there's a question in the second row in the middle here.
Walter Manoschek, Universität Wien. Ich habe eine Frage an die Kollegin Fritz, die etwas über ihr Referat hinausgeht. Ich habe in der Literatur bislang nichts gefunden, was erklärt, wie die ungarischen Juden im Ghetto in Budapest überlebt haben und warum sie überlebt haben. Also ich kenne nur ein Dokument von Ribbentrop, der ich glaube schon im Oktober fordert, dass die Deportationen stattfinden sollen. Aber dann gibt es weder bei Braham noch bei Ali Gerlach oder sonst wo eine Erklärung dafür, warum, also bis zur Einkesselung durch die Rote Armee Anfang Jänner, Ende Dezember, es zu keinen Deportationen gekommen ist. Hängt das mit dem Pfeilkreuzlern zusammen oder gibt es hier andere Erklärungsansätze?
Ja, vielen Dank für die Frage. An und für sich hat es, also die Budapester Juden sind sozusagen diese erste Deportationswelle nicht deportiert worden, von der ich sprach. Sie sind ja erst dann, also die Deportationen sind zuvor gestoppt worden durch Horthy und im Oktober sind die dann in die zwei Ghettos gezogen. Aber es hatte dann aus diesen Ghettos sehr wohl Deportationen gegeben, die aber nicht mehr auf diese Weise stattgefunden haben, wie die in der ersten Deportationsphase, nämlich nicht per Zug nach Auschwitz in erster Linie, sondern eigentlich zu Fuß Richtung österreichische Grenze. Und hier hat man sehr, sehr viele arbeitsfähige Frauen und noch verbleibende auch Männer. Die meisten waren ja beim Arbeitsdienst, aber auch die sind dann Richtung Österreich getrieben worden. Und letzten Endes sind dann im Ghetto selbst dann nur noch Kinder und die alten Leute geblieben. Und es waren halt in erster Linie auch die Transportschwierigkeiten, und dann natürlich das Vorrücken der Front und das Ende des Krieges, das ja in Budapest ja dann schon im Januar, Budapest wurde schon im Januar von den russischen Truppen befreit. Und all dies hat dann sozusagen auch dazu geführt, dass die Ghettobevölkerung weitestgehend unter sehr schlechten Bedingungen aber dann doch überleben konnte.
Dr. Lietzen, ich bin von der ABODA, Bund der sozialdemokratischen Juden und Bund der Freiheitskämpfer. Ich bin zuständig für den 1. Bezirk. Auf diese Frage ergänzend möchte ich sagen, da gibt es ein sehr gutes Buch vom inzwischen leider verstorbenen, also Professor Johnny Moser. Und zwar, ich war Laufbursche des Raoul Wallenberg. Johnny Moser war ja selbst also, nach der Halacha, also jüdisch, weil also seine Mutter war Jüdin, der Vater war also nicht jüdisch und war ursprünglich aus Pandorf. Und Pandorf wurde ja dann also faktisch also in der NS-Zeit eben zu Ungarn also faktisch gerechnet. Das heißt, dass nämlich die Juden, die dort also eingeschrieben waren, wie eben auch die Familie Moser, über die Grenze ständig nach Ungarn abgeschoben wurden. Und die Ungarn haben natürlich gesagt, hallo, ihr seid ja Österreicher, ihr gehört wieder zurück. Jetzt sind die monatelang hin und her geschoben worden, natürlich vollkommen also expropriiert, das heißt also enteignet, sind aber dann durch glückliche Umstände eben über Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest gelandet. Und dort war es eben so, dass hier lange Zeit, also unter dem Regime Horthy, die Juden nicht verfolgt wurden. Ja? Aber es gab natürlich von den Pfeilkreuzlern her schon also Repressionen und auch zum Beispiel das sogenannte Judenschießen. Ja, wo eben die Juden in die Donau geschossen wurden, nicht? Mussten sich aufstellen, also wurden also faktisch rekrutiert aus ihren Häusern, die natürlich also auch alle enteignet waren, rausgetrieben, mussten sich zur Donau stellen und wurden dort eben dann erschossen und eben in den Fluss geworfen. Ja? Aber wie gesagt, also hier kann ich nur auf dieses Buch verweisen. Ich war Laufbursche des Raoul Wallenberg. Danke.
Mein Name ist Diesmann Bruno, ich bin privat hier und ich habe eine Frage an die Frau Fritz. Wie weit waren die Funktionsträger in Debrecen schon zu Horthys Zeiten aktiv und können Sie da irgendwie über diese Zusammenhänge zu Horthy etwas Genaueres sagen, weil ich glaube, es ist außerdem heute eine sehr wichtige politische Frage in Ungarn. Nicht? Vielen Dank.
Ja, an und für sich muss man natürlich sagen, dass Horthy nach der deutschen Besatzung ja nach wie vor an Reichsverweser sozusagen tätig war. Erst eben im Oktober wurde er abgelöst, 1944. Das heißt also, all diese Deportationen, Ghettoisierung, über die ich sprach, die fiel noch in seine Zeit, auch wenn er sich damals sozusagen dafür aussprach, sich sozusagen auszunehmen von allen Maßnahmen, die sich mit antijüdischer Politik beschäftigen nach der deutschen Besatzung. Also da gab es eben diese Bitte von ihm. Aber es passierte alles unter seiner Regentschaft sozusagen. In Debrecen und auch in anderen Städten wurden sehr viele Beamte aus dieser Horthy-Ära, also sozusagen aus der Zeit vor der deutschen Besatzung, abgelöst. Zum Beispiel auch der Obergespann, den ich hier genannt habe, auch er war wurde er sozusagen erst nach der deutschen Besatzung erhielt er diesen Posten. Und zum Beispiel der Bürgermeister, der hier auch ziemlich gemäßigtere Rolle in diesen Besprechungen zumindest eingenommen hat, er ist dann einen Monat später oder einige Wochen später zurückgetreten. Und dazu wurde er eben auch von diesem Obergespann, der hier eben eine radikalere Politik verfolgen wollte, ermuntert sozusagen.
We see one question in the back, and also if there's any other questions, we will take them now and bundle them together.
Ich will hier nur 3 kurze Bemerkungen machen zu Horthy, der angeblich, wo die Juden wo es sie so gut hatten. Erste Bemerkung: Unter Horthy wurden judendiskriminierende Gesetze erlassen von 1920 und bis zur deutschen Besatzung. Zweite Bemerkung: Es gab eine Deportation von 20.000 Juden nach Kamenetz-Podolsk im Sommer 1941. Dritte Bemerkung: Es gab ein Pogrom der ungarischen Armee und Gendarmerie in Novi Sad, Újvidék, Neusatz im Januar 1942. Und noch eine vierte Bemerkung, Zusatz. Ein großer Teil der jüdischen Zwangsarbeiter, die der ungarischen Armee beigeordnet waren, wurden über die Minenfelder gejagt, beziehungsweise grausam von ihren ungarischen Begleitern ermordet oder gefoltert und hatten also weniger Chancen zu überleben als die ungarische Armee, die ja dann auch große Verluste hatte. So viel zu heute.
Alexander Korb vom Wiesenthal-Institut. Ich habe eine Frage, Kommentar an Regina, aber auch an Daniel. Und ich fand übrigens, dass die Paper sehr gut zusammengepasst haben, weil man sich sozusagen die verschiedenen Konstellationen sehr gut zusammendenken konnte, fand ich. Aus meiner eigenen Forschung zu Kroatien kenne ich ganz ähnliche Fälle, wo sozusagen der Besitz von Leuten, die deportiert worden sind, im Dorf neu verteilt wird. Da handelt es sich um Serben, die 1941 aus Kroatien vertrieben werden oder ausgesiedelt und deren Besitz im Dorf neu verteilt wird. Da handelt es sich ums Vieh, um die Kühe, aber auch um den Hausrat. Die Felder müssen neu bestellt werden. Und daraufhin entsteht eine soziale Dynamik in diesen Dörfern, wo sozusagen das ganze Dorf eigentlich mitarbeiten muss, da Sachzwänge geschaffen werden, da die Sachen ja irgendwo unterkommen müssen. Das Vieh muss versorgt werden, die Felder müssen bestellt werden. Und so beteiligen sich eigentlich die ganze Dorfgemeinschaft an dieser Aussiedlung der Serben und an der Bewältigung der Folgen, ohne dass die eigentlich sozusagen bösen Willen hatten oder das von Anfang an intendiert war. Und schließlich natürlich werden bei den Auktionen wird der Hausrat verscherbelt. Also eigentlich eine ähnliche Dynamik wie in diesem ungarischen Fall, wo sich alle irgendwie Gedanken machen müssen, wie machen wir das eigentlich oder wie bewältigen wir das? Und sich die Frage stellen, wie kann unser Dorf davon profitieren, von dieser Aktion, die wir jetzt vielleicht nicht unbedingt wollten, aber die nun mal geschehen ist. Da wollte ich eben fragen, ob im ungarischen, aber auch im kroatischen Fall, ob euch ähnliche Fälle bekannt sind, wo so eine Dynamik des Social Engineerings entsteht und wie weit die reicht. Ich habe da eigentlich sozusagen keine Fälle, wo sich Leute aktiv dem entziehen, weil sie sagen, ich will damit nichts zu tun haben, sondern auf allen Ebenen beteiligen sich die Menschen, ob sie jetzt nun Petitionen schreiben und schreiben, so kann es besser gemacht werden, oder ob sie aus purer Gier sich an Ramsch-Aktionen beteiligen. Danke.
Okay, are there any other questions? Anybody would like to ask or comments? Okay, would you like to respond?
This happens quite frequently, where an Ustasha unit will usually comprised of emigres coming from Italy will massacre a village and then allow the local peasants to help themselves to their belongings. In a lot of cases, this kind of creates a dynamic where the Serbs who flee to the hills and later start forming rebel guerrillas see the entire village as complicit in the crime, even though none of them killed. They just, took items which many of them would end up needing when famine hits and all that. But that it's a way in which the Ustasha regime can kind of win over people who might not have been on board their ideological agenda, because now by feeling complicit in the robbery, they have to worry about what's going to happen if the partisan unit takes over power, and will they be, will the person whose cow they took come back to take revenge on them?
Ja, also zum ungarischen Beispiel. Es gibt natürlich schon Stimmen, die versuchen sozusagen eben auch entradikalisierend zu wirken oder eben auch nicht bereit sind, Beamte hier auch mitzuwirken und teilweise auch zurücktreten angesichts der Ghettoisierung. Was mich an diesem Protokoll, den ich hier eben vorgestellt habe, auch so schockiert hat, ist eigentlich diese Sprache und diese starke Bürokratie und rationelle Überlegungen, wo es also eigentlich gar nicht mehr darum geht, was hier eigentlich passiert. Also all dieser Hintergrund wird hier ausgeblendet. Es gibt eben nur dieses Problem, dass man auf eine bürokratische Art und Weise diskutiert und dass sie auf eine bürokratische Art und Weise lösen wollen. Zu der Interaktion oder auch zur Radikalisierung, und das ist, habe ich jetzt in dem Vortrag nicht erwähnen können, aber trägt ja teilweise auch die Bevölkerung bei, zum Beispiel durch die Aussiedlungen. Aus diesen Wohngebieten müssen ja teilweise auch nicht-jüdische Bewohner, wie ja auch in anderen Ländern, ausgesiedelt werden. Und hier gibt es ja teilweise auch Beschwerden dann von der Bevölkerungsseite, die dann dazu führen, dass sich dann die staatliche Verwaltung dann sich doch dazu entscheidet, das Ghetto doch nicht in der Stadt einzurichten, sondern außerhalb, eben unter sehr schlechten Bedingungen. Also hier gibt es dann auch solche Radikalisierungen, die hier von der Bevölkerung angestoßen werden.
Thanks very much. I believe now we have a coffee break until 4:30. Before we break, please join me in thanking the panel.